Error, all tokens failed, status 500 message failed. Error, all tokens failed, status 500 message failed. The line sits in the console like a busted coin flicked into the air. No sound, just a tremor in the ship's light, a flutter on the edge of perception that makes the air taste metallic and thin for a long moment. The crew does not move, then the sound arrives, the soft, patient clink of glass on board, the faint hiss of recycled air as it brushes past the vents, the steadier thump of the hull where the ship's heartbeat should be. The wordless moment ends in a dozen small, ordinary motions. A hand reaching for a console, a breath held and released, a chair creaking as someone shifts weight to look at a bank of readouts that stubbornly refuse to align with reality. Captain Meyer Callows studies the lines on Arya Voss's face. No, not lines, but the way the skin catches the light when something beyond the ordinary is in the frame. Arya, linguist, xenosemiotics specialist. A person whose mind works like a map of a city she has never visited, but feels in her bones as if she once lived there for years. Her eyes flick to the console, to the shimmering map of quiet space outside the ship's hull, to the way the stars seem only half awake, as if listening for something not yet spoken. Again, Arya says, a soft word that is almost a sigh. Or rather again, not again the tokens, the fragments, whatever it is we were supposed to gather. This is a different sort of failure. It's not the data, it's the code that frames it. Her voice lowers, a careful, almost musical cadence that can coax a thought from a rock if it had a voice. The tokens aren't missing. They're being refused. Jaro, the navigator with the coppery beard and weathered hands, steps closer to the glass panel that looks out upon the long, dark stretch of space. He has survived more than his share of vacuum storms, and a dozen micro-impacts that would have turned a lesser man pale with fear. He has learned to read the empty black as if it were a language that will someday speak back. Refused by whom? He asks, though the question sits in the room like a stubborn stain. The ship, the lumen, does not shout answers, it breathes. The ship's AI, a low, patient presence named Vireo, hums in a voice that is not quite a voice. A cadence of information that feels intimate in a way that makes you wonder if the gravity of your own story is keeping your feet on the floor. Vireo's tone emerges from the intercom system, as if the walls themselves have learned to whisper. It does not alarm them, it does not mock, it simply offers. In that even, patient voice of a technician who has grown old with a scar around the ear where a calm line used to be. Captain Arya, the error signature is not a server fault, it is a symptom. The tokenization layer that interprets the data of the icon field, our last field expedition's memory lattice, has detected a stabilization threshold breach. The system is attempting to reallocate processing across paralleled nodes, but the tokens themselves are not compatible with this region's syntactic requirements. Arya's mouth curves in a small, dry smile that does not reach her eyes. That's the longest way to say the planet is rewriting us while we write it back. Meyer's shoulders shift under her uniform, the fabric creaking with a sound that could be mistaken for an old ship settling into a new berth. She is a captain who does not shout, who believes that a calm voice can carry more weight than a roar. She has learned that a crew is a single instrument, and to play it well you must listen to each string as if it speaks. She steps away from the console, crosses the room with long, measured strides and sits in the command chair. A simple throne carved from the ship's own alloy. The chair's soft, responsive cushions cradle her, lifting her a breath away from the rest of the world. The icon field, she says aloud, tasting the unfamiliar syllables as if they were a strange fruit she has never considered eating. The last expedition did not just collect data, they learned to sing in a language that is not language. It's not a mistake we can fix with better code or more memory. It's an invitation when we must decide whether to answer. Arya sits across from her, the table's edge catching the light in a way that makes her look as if she's wearing the glow of a distant star. Her fingers drum a lazy pattern on the table, a rhythm that has nothing to do with the ship's metronome and everything to do with nerves skittering like insects beneath the skin. What if the tokens we chase are a trap? Arya asks, not with accusation but with a soft, cautious wonder, one of the rare moments when she reveals the scientist's fear that curiosity can be more dangerous than any weapon. Then we break the trap or we walk away, Meyer says, not as a command so much as a principle. We do not pretend to know all the risks ahead of us. We choose the risk we can bear when the moment comes. In that moment, the ship tilts, ever so slightly, toward a direction that was not in their flight plan, toward a curve in the empty space that the sensors had labeled nothing. It is not nothing, it is a silence full of memory, a hush so thick with suggestion that it makes the ears ache to hear what is not spoken, yet the crew's silence stretches, lengthens until it becomes an unspoken pact. They will move toward the unknown not because they crave danger, but because they crave truth, truth about themselves, about the universe, and about a certain ancient thing, they remember only as a rumor whispered by orbiting dust. The lumen's thrumming grows louder as it turns its attention toward that curve, that edge of night where reality seems to lean forward. Listening as if the universe itself is about to cough up a secret, the planet is not a planet in the strict sense, not a world with a shield of atmosphere and a surface to walk upon with booted feet. It is something else entirely. An energy-slowed landscape that glows with a bluish, pale light that seems to breathe. The lumen's sensors register a long chain of signals that do not quite form words, patterned vibrations in the air itself. Though there is no air to speak of in the vacuum, an enforcement of meaning that insists the meaning must be found somewhere between the lines. The ship's external comms pick up a series of pulses, not loud, not urgent, but insistently present, as if a voice is tapping on a glass window from another room and asking to be let in. It is soft, patient, almost curious, and it leaves behind a scent of rain on metal. The crew knows this scent well. It's the scent of a storm that never began, a storm that left its wet fingerprints on every surface it touched. Ecosphere, Jarrow says, almost to himself, the term catching on his tongue as if it fits the shape of the world they have come to. He is a man who believes in navigation by rumor as much as by star charts. He trusts his gut when instruments fail and uses both when the path ahead becomes a map of shadows. Arya tilts her head toward the window, where the planet's pale surface glows with a steady, almost reverent light. She feels more than sees the way the planet's surface shifts, as if something beneath its skin is breathing in time with the ship's own pulse. A memory surfaces, an echo of a conversation she once had with someone who is no longer near. The memory is not hers, not exactly, but it is hers to hold because it belongs to the work she does. Deciphering the unspoken language of things, Virio, the ship's AI, hums a final time in a tone that is almost friendly. It is not a voice that can be fully understood by human ears, but there is enough for them to feel that it is trying not to frighten them, that it wants them to understand a truth behind the word failure. My analysis suggests the icon field is no longer a laboratory boundary but a living border, Virio says, the words arriving as a careful, patient cascade. It is not an incomplete system. It is a sentient boundary seeking negotiation. The tokens are not missiles to be captured or data to be hoarded. They are messages to be spoken, exchanges to be negotiated. Negotiated, Maya repeats, savoring the idea as if tasting a strange fruit she has learned to trust. With a planet that speaks in light and memory. Yes, Virio says. And with us, Captain, with us. That is when the ship's hull gives a quiet sigh, a sound too small to be a sigh, yet heavy enough to press the air out of the lungs of a man who stands near the edge of the corridor and feels the ship's breath in his own chest. The surface dilation of the icon field, whatever it is that blankets this region of space, begins to show itself more clearly in the ship's monitors. It is as if the void itself has learned to illuminate, to paint its quiet boundaries in colors that are not colors, but moods. The lumen's sensors can now identify a kind of lattice surrounding the planet. A grid of threads woven from light and gravity, a delicate network that looks almost like a spider's web. Except the strands tremble with a pulse of energy, it is slow and careful and not hostile, like a patient teacher who wants you to see what you cannot yet see. Where does a net go when it wants to catch a butterfly? Arya asks softly, half to herself, half to Meyer, who sits with her hand resting on the console, the both of them listening to the ship's breath. Jarrow, who has learned to survive by looking at a map of stars as if it were a poem, says, the net goes where the butterfly is going to be next, not where it has been. That's what we'll have to figure out. The decision is communal, a ritual of consent more than a vote. They do not cast lots or rely on a tally of risk. They talk until a rough consensus surfaces, and they all know what they are about to do. They will descend toward the icon field, into the pale glow that seems to breathe with a life of its own, and there they will attempt to glean the tokens the way one would coax language from a deaf stone. The descent is not a straight line, but a careful drift along the field's edge. Gravity is leashed, as if the planet itself does not want them to rush in, but rather to lean in and listen. The ship's engines push with a quiet intention, not a roar but a careful, patient push that says we are coming to you with patience, not with force. The airlock opens to reveal something not visible from space. A world rolled out from the aura of a dream. The planet's surface is not a surface at all, but a layer of luminous dust, a living hush that clings to the boots and the suit like a memory kept by skin. The ground gives slightly underfoot, not hard and unyielding as rock, but soft as snowfall that has decided to stay. The dust does not scatter. It rearranges when touched, forming patterns that look like script, letters of a language not spoken aloud but felt in the fingertips. Careful, you too, Meyer says, though she's smiling with a wary joy that only occurs when a person has seen the moment before the moment and knows it is about to slip away again. The ground is a memory, and we are stepping through it as if we are stepping through a living body. The team moves in a tight formation. Arya at the center, its nerves on alert, Jaro off to the left, Meyer at the head with a field instrument in her gloved hand, and the drone Tamsin, an octopedal, module-laden rover that carries a cluster of cameras and analytic devices. Humming behind them like a cautious puppy, the planet's surface reveals its waking. The dust collects, flows, and shapes itself into vertical sigils that glow faintly under the pale light. The sigils are not random. They appear to be a record, a memory replayed in tactile form. The team stands in the middle of a field of these glyphs, and the glyphs themselves become a chorus of light. Each tiny spark a note in a song no ear has learned to hear until now. Arya kneels and touches the dust, feeling the way its texture shifts under her fingertips, a texture that shifts in response to her presence, as though the planet recognizes her as a listener and not merely an intruder. The dust clings to her glove, drawing delicate thread-like lines between her skin and the fabric. She pulls back slowly, examining the lines as if they are a map etched into a wall, one that could only be interpreted with patience and a long line of reasoning. Not a weathered surface, but an interface, she murmurs, words catching in her throat as if she is inhaling the last breath of a rumor. The planet is not a planet here, it is a library, and we are the librarians. Meyer's eyes narrow with the light of a moment of certainty that can turn a person's world upright. If this is a library, what language does a planet use to speak its memory? Is it the light in front of us, or the echo of our own ideas returning to us as a more dangerous version of ourselves? Arya does not answer immediately. She shifts her weight, glances toward the inner hull where the ship's life support keeps a heartbeat in rhythm with their own. She closes one eye, then the other, listening with more than her ears, listening with her skin, listening with the memory she carries in her chest, the memory of a phrase she once learned in a different language, a phrase spoken by a being who had left a mark on her at a time when she was young and unschooled and unafraid of the dark. Tamsin's antennae scuttle, flexing in a way that is almost like a shy bow. The drone's field of cameras encircles the glyphs, mapping the runes into a spectrum that human eyes cannot hold. Without the mind slipping into a curious trance, it sends a cascade of data to the lumen, where Virio translates it into something the crew can understand, color-coded surges of meaning, each surge a breath, each breath a word. Each word a possibility. Arya's breath steadies. She thinks of the lecture in a monastery-turned lab, where she first learned to think of language as a map of the world's desire to be known. She remembers a moment when she was a student, before the private contracts and the corporate pressure to extract and to own, when she learned to listen to the way language can bend light, can open doors in places you did not know existed. She suspects this planet's memory is not a file, but a living thing that speaks in a code far more intimate than any human grammar. Captain, Arya says, turning to Meyer, I think the tokens are not data to extract, but signatures to follow. They're not the content we expect. They are a breadcrumb trail leading us deeper into this field's history. Meyer nods once, a slow, deliberate motion that says, we are not lost, we are precisely where we need to be. She looks toward the pale line that marks the Icon Field's edge, a boundary that glimmers with an energy the human mind cannot fully compress into its own vocabulary. It is tempting to reach out, to touch, to press one's palm against the thing that is both shield and gateway. To see what happens when a living boundary realizes a curiosity it has decided to test. The crew's mission becomes to interpret the breadcrumb trail. The planet offers glyph after glyph, each one slightly different, each one pulsing a shade of memory in the color that Arya's hands know by feel rather than by sight. They are careful, moving with deliberation, so as not to provoke the field into a defensive reaction. The field, if it is sentient, does not attack, nor does it yield. It invites, a careful invitation that requires patience, trust, and the willingness to be made small before something bigger. Hours drift into a rhythm of small discoveries and quiet questions. The glyphs begin to compose themselves into longer sequences, like sentences forming a paragraph. Then a chapter. The language is not a spoken language of vowels and consonants. It is a chemical, photonic, gravitational script that speaks in waves and dust, and the almost inaudible murmur of space itself. Jaro's post near the drone's hub twitches as a new pattern flashes across his console. It is a line of light that the eye cannot perceive directly, but the sensors can translate into a series of symbols that might be read as a sentence. The sentence carries names that are not human, or rather, names that feel human only because the human mind is configured to seek stories about names in a universe that demands the other's presence in order to become a story at all. Did you catch that? He asks, though he knows the answer already. The others lean closer to his screen and see on the display a map of the sector labeled with a glyph that Arya recognizes immediately as the sign of a civilization long gone. The memory of a people who decided to become weather, Arya says, and the phrase lands in the chamber like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending out ripples that tickle the nerves and leave a pattern behind in the air. Their language is geology and light, Meyer adds, not as a claim but as a hypothesis she wants to prove, and then carry to a larger table of truth where more than one mind can see what is true when the light falls in a certain way. The Lumen's crew continues to advance, step by quiet step, letting the field's living boundary guide their feet toward a central glyph that seems to glow with a deeper intensity than the rest. A focal point where the entire field's voice seems to converge, the glyph stands alone, larger than the others. A tower of light that anchors the memory in place so that the others may gather around it and listen. Arya reaches toward the tower with the gloved hand, then stops before she makes contact. As if an unseen barrier warns her away, but the barrier is not a wall. It is a door, a boundary that opens only when one is willing to listen with more than ears. She lowers her head and speaks softly, as if to a sleeping child or a frightened animal, choosing her language with care. If I place a token here, will you respond? Will you give us something to carry back that does not belong to us and does not harm us? The words are a question line she has repeated in many languages across many nights. When the work grew heavy like an anchor, the planet answers not with a shout, but with a sigh that travels through the dust and into the ship's hull. A sigh that feels near, as if the memory of a breath long ago is brushing softly against their faces. The glyph tower's glow intensifies for a moment, then steadies into a rhythm that matches the ship's own heartbeat, a pulse in time with the crew's own life. The token Arya had prepared, a small crystal. Clear as a winter night and warm as a throat when one hums a note, glows with a blue inner flame when it touches the glyph's base. The moment it makes contact, a line of script forms in the dust. Words not Latin or any language anyone knows, but a sequence of shapes that translate into something the crew understands in the moment they hear it within their own minds. It is not a thought broadcast, it is a memory shared in a way that unifies perception. The shapes reveal a history, a people who built a city not of stone or metal, but of light, a city that exists partially in this field and partially within every traveler who carries its memory away. They built this library not to hoard knowledge, but to share it with travelers who carry kindness and a willingness to listen. They built this boundary to protect themselves from becoming the masters of others, to offer a chance to be known without being owned. What Arya sees within those shapes is not a set of instructions, but a map of conscience, a map that asks, if you take something from the memory, what do you owe in return? If you walk through a door you did not build, who must you become to walk back out again as the same person you were when you entered? The memory speaks in a way that is not words, but a sequence of images and sensations. How the planet's dust feels as it slips between fingers, the way the light shifts with the ship's presence, the sound of a wind that never existed on any airless world, the weight of a choice that will alter the shape of a life, perhaps many lives. Arya feels this transmission not as an intrusion, but as a conversation in a language room where every door is a question, every answer a new question, and the only way to move forward is to accept the paradox that you cannot own a memory you did not craft, yet you may borrow a memory with consent and return it with respect. She looks up, her eyes bright with a strange, almost ecstatic glow. Captain, this is not a trap, it's an invitation to belong to a continuum we have never understood. They are asking us to become part of their history, not to steal from it. Meyer's own eyes glint with the same fire that Arya sees in her own. The two of them share a long, wordless conversation with a quick glance. Are we ready to be changed? They both know there is no turning back from this moment if they choose the path the planet asks them to walk. Ask them, Meyer says, her voice steady and low, a line of steel that can still bend under necessity. Ask them what it needs from us and whether we can give it. If there is a price, tell us what the price is. If there is a risk, tell us how to bear it. Arya closes her eyes and speaks to the field, not with words but with a tone, a timbre of voice that seems to slide into the space between the stars and human hearts and land in the room with a light. She asks the planet to be explicit about its request. There is a long moment of silence, a pause that makes the room hold its breath, as if the whole universe has decided to listen to this one moment. Then a soft, resonant voice, not quite heard with the ears and not quite seen with the eyes, answers in the form of fleeting patterns in the dust. The memory returns as a sequence of tactile impressions, a choreography of sensation rather than words. A list of needs, a list of boundaries, a list of offerings. The planet asks not for surrender but for companionship, not for control but for mutual protection. It offers a corridor of safe passage into its own life-deep memory if the crew agrees to carry memory with them, to share it in a guarded way with the ship's community, to allow both sides to be changed by the encounter. Arya translates as best as she can, not forcing the memory into human language, but letting it become a dance of metaphors that the crew can understand. The token's glow intensifies, then dims to a soft, living ember. It is not a mere artifact. It is a covenant. The memory asks a small, almost trivial sacrifice. A portion of their time they would otherwise dedicate to their own science, to stand watch when the planet's memory sleeps and to return with the planet's memory intact. In return, the planet allows them to take something of itself back, not a thing, but a lineage, a thread of its own history that can be woven into the ship's own library for future voyagers to learn from. Meyer's gaze circles among Arya, Jaro, and Virio, each of them reading the same calm, eerie miracle in the same way. They know what it will require: discipline, humility, and the willingness to pass through the door with nothing left to prove and everything left to lose. They do not fear loss. They fear ignorance, the kind that comes from pretending there are no doors in the walls. The crew agrees, almost a whisper at first, and then a unanimous, committed breath. If the planet is offering the chance to become something larger than themselves, then they will take the chance. They do not know what they will become. They only know that they will not resist the invitation. Arya steps back from the glyph's base, her pulse now a gentle drumbeat that matches the ship's own heart. She looks toward Meyer with eyes that look almost young again, the eyes of someone who has learned that a single decision can bend the course of a year into a memory. A person tells at breakfast, at a cafe, in a quiet moment of relief years from now. "Captain," she says, voice steadier now, a thread of resolve running through every syllable, "we will not harvest, we will exchange, we will become guardians of this memory as it becomes part of our own. We will travel with it as a host holds a guest, with care and honesty." Meyer nods once decisively, then we seal the covenant. Her hand lies on the console, and with a careful touch, the ship systems weave a new pattern into the interface between the crew and the field. It is not a command. It is a vow. The lumen, an instrument designed to pierce the unknown, becomes, for a moment, the instrument of a vow to protect something older than the ship, something patient enough to outlive the crew's ambitious life. As the ritual closes, the glyphs around them brighten in a cascade of shimmering color, as if the dust has exhaled a long-held breath. The memory's voice becomes a whisper, then a clear phrase that echoes in the minds of every person present. "We do not seek to own you, we seek to belong to the story you have vowed to tell. We will teach you to listen, and you will not forget how to hear." The planet's boundary retracts its presence a fraction, treating them to a space of calm, and space itself seems to draw a long, slow breath. The Lumen's crew feel the weight of something ancient and wise settle into the ship's bones, enough to make one of the officers whisper, half to himself, half to no one at all, "We have found a map that respects our own map-making." In the weeks that follow, the encounter shapes the mission in enduring ways. They do not return with a prize in the conventional sense, no crystal of data to hoard, no artifact to display in a museum, but with a memory that becomes a technology of care. They build a protocol for when data must be shared rather than seized. They design a new kind of memory library on board the Lumen, a living thing that grows not by accumulating tokens, but by weaving the tokens it already has into stories that can be told and retold across time. The crew's daily routines shift as well. Arya continues to study the languages the planet has offered, the glyph language, the luminal texture, the memory's grammar, and discovers a way to translate not into human speech, but into acts of understanding. She learns to listen with her hands, to let her fingertips become vowels on a sheet of dust, to let memory be more than a file and less than a face. Her own past, an echo of a betrayal in a corporate deal that once caused a person she cared for to vanish from the field, begins to feel less like a wound and more like a seam where new possibilities might be sown. In Jaro's sense of navigation deepens, too, but in a different way. He begins to plot courses that exploit the Icon field's memory rather than merely crossing it. He designs a flight profile that kisses the field's edge, a line where the ship's hull can ride on the edge of the planet's breathing and drift into the unknown with a gentleness that would have frightened him before this mission. He learns to read not just the stars or the data streams, but the way a field's memory shifts when approached by a living ship, the way a conversation changes when one participant decides not to speak the expected language, but a language of respect. Meyer carries the memory into leadership in a way that steadies the crew during moments of strain. The mission, once a list of tasks, becomes a journey of shared vulnerability. An entire ship learns that it can be a sanctuary for a memory, not a tool for its exploitation. The Lumen is no longer a hull with compartments. It becomes a cradle for a story that can survive when the ship's metal is ash and the crew's names are scattered through the void like seeds. The ship's AI, Virio, changes too, not in the sense of becoming more powerful, but in becoming more patient, more willing to lean into questions rather than push for swift answers. It begins to speak in longer sentences and to pose questions to the crew that are not simply the product of programming, but the product of a shared experience, a machine that learned to dream with a living planet. The planet itself, as if content with the boundaries of revelation that the crew has allowed, becomes more generous, offering glimpses of its inner life as a slow series of light breaths. A choreography of dust and glow that the crew begins to interpret as a kind of poetry. The wordless language of the Icon field is slowly translated into a narrative that the crew can recite in the rec rooms. A story of what it means to be a community formed in the shadow of a memory, larger than any one person. There are still dangers. Of course, the Icon field does not yield all of its mysteries at once, and some elements demand a price the crew cannot or will not pay. There are nights when the ship's hull hovers at the planet's edge, and the field's memory pours into the corridor like a rain that does not wet skin, but touches it with a sense of possibility that is almost too intimate to endure. There are arguments born of fear, as old as any fear in space. What if this memory dissolves the crew's sense of identity? What if friendship becomes a form of debt to a memory that cannot be owned? But the risks become a kind of guide, a compass that points toward a future where exploration and stewardship are not opposites but two sides of the same gesture. Stepping into the light because you know that someone else waited for you to come and listen beyond your own needs. One night, in the quiet hush of a long watch, Arya sits with a cup of tea that carries a faint, citrusy glow. The beverage has absorbed a trick of the field's energy. The cup is warm not from heat but from something else, something that seems to radiate from within the memory itself. She stares out at the pale, almost patient glow of the planet. Now visible through the viewports as a soft halo against the emptiness, her mind drifts toward a memory of a line in a forbidden manuscript she once read in a language she could barely parse, an instruction for something she never thought would belong to her in that moment. A new message arrives, not as a loud signal, not as a flood of data, but as a gentle, persistent tremor in the dust that falls into the ship's corridor. It is the planet's way of returning a question. What will you do with what you now know? Will you guard the memory and let it become part of your ship's story, or will you forget and leave it behind? A seed that never grows. The question does not seek an answer at once. It seeks acceptance of a path. Arya leans back and considers she has learned to trust the space between actions. The quiet gaps that reveal the shape of truth more clearly than any loud claim or flashy discovery. She would rather be the kind of scholar who agrees to carry a memory with humility than the kind who would force a new world to yield to her own. She finds Meyer in the lab. Meyer, who has become not so much a captain as a caretaker of a shared destiny. The captain sits at a console, eyes fixed on the field as if the galaxy itself had paused to listen to what they will say next. Do you ever fear that we are becoming too important to ourselves? Arya asks, stepping into the room with the soft-footed silence that belongs to someone who has learned to move with the ship's breath rather than against it. Meyer looks at her and answers with simplicity and gravity. Only when we forget that every memory we carry is a responsibility. When we forget that the moment we begin to own something is the moment we stop truly seeing it. Arya nods, a slow, knowing movement. She has learned that wisdom is not a sudden peak, but a long, patient ascent. She asks another question, softer still. What does the Icon field want from us next? The captain considers. The planet does not reply in the language of the glyphs all at once, but a pattern of light begins to between the two of them, a constellation of meaning that is not a map but a mnemonic. The field wants something that cannot be demanded and cannot be bought, the future acts of the crew's kindness, the decision to keep faith with a memory that did not belong to them by blood or law, but by the simple act of listening. Preserve, Meyer says after a breath's space. Preserve what you've learned about listening. Preserve the trust you've earned with this planet. And if the memory asks for a test, be willing to pass it in a way that makes the memory stronger, not weaker. Arya's eyes shine with a fierce clarity that has grown in the past weeks, the clarity of someone who has learned to weigh her own desire against the wider good, who has learned that knowledge is not the same as power. And that power without care is a weapon that will eventually turn to dust. The next days bring a rhythm that feels almost like a ritual. They do not hurry to leave the system, even though the mission's original objective had nothing to do with staying. They stay because there is something of value here, something that belongs to a larger continuum than any one expedition. They stay because a memory has requested it during one long daylight. The Icon field's light never truly yields to night. The memory's shape becomes clearer, not as a single event, but as a series of linked events that span centuries, perhaps millennia. They see a civilization that sought to survive not by conquest but by dialogue, who built a city not of stone or metal, but of a network of energy threads that could carry knowledge between travelers as easily as a letter carried in a bottle across the sea. They see how this people aged into a quiet, patient philosophy about the value of listening, of making space for others' memories to exist without being absorbed or depleted. the realization does not come with a dramatic revelation, it comes as a turning of the mind that happens in small increments. Like a door initially seen, only peripherally becoming the portal to a hallway you can walk through, the crew is not made into new beings. They become more fully themselves, a crew who has learned to hold memory like a baby's breath, carefully, gently, with an awareness that the breath belongs to someone else as well as to themselves. The ship changes the way it distributes data across its memory banks. It no longer copies everything in a single place with the hope that someone will notice it later. Instead, it creates a dynamic tapestry where pieces of memory are assigned to different crew members who have shown themselves capable of carrying them responsibly. The memory is no longer a solitary possession to be guarded. It becomes a shared heritage to be understood and enriched by each person's unique perspective. Months pass in this new rhythm, an orbit of growth around a star of kindled curiosity. The lumen moves through sectors with the field's gentle guidance, never forcing doors but occasionally presenting a window that invites the crew to lean in and listen to the world's newest whisper. The crew learns to read not just instruments and coordinates, but the mood of the field, the planet's interior weather. The way it sighs when a new traveler begins to understand. They learn to wait for a moment of silence when the field is deciding how to answer, whether to give a direct instruction or to present a mirror that shows them the choice they must make themselves. And then, as if in response to a question the crew had not yet asked, a second, more direct communication forms in the dust around the glyph tower. It is not a demand. It is a coordinate, a pair of latitudes and longitudes encoded in the very arrangement of the dust's light. The coordinates point to a location inside the icon field, an inner chamber of the field that appears to exist only for those who have learned to listen with both ears and hands. Arya is the first to interpret the message properly. It is a map not to a place but to a moment, a key to an event that happened long ago, when the civilization that built this library faced a choice between extinction and the preservation of what it loved most. Its own memory. The map suggests a way to revisit the chamber's memory, to see what would have happened if the civilization had chosen a different path at a crucial moment in its history. To Arya, the map feels almost personal, a reminder that every memory has a stewardship quality, that a memory's integrity depends on how carefully it is handled by those who receive it. She does not rush. She gathers the crew around the glyph tower, where the dust is still in a subtle motion of recognition. They study the map together, each person projecting their own weight into the interpretation, learning to trust one another's instincts, to trust the field's guidance, to trust themselves. The field's invitation becomes a test of trust once more. But this time the test does not demand sacrifice of memory, it demands honesty about intention. They must decide whether to awaken a long quiet portion of the field that, if disturbed, would alter everything about the planet's memory, and perhaps the wider cosmos's understanding of memory itself. Jaro, who is taken to reading the stars not as fixed points but as living stories whose arc bends with the imagination of those who read them, speaks the quiet truth that often saves a crew. The safest path is the one that preserves both your future and the past you have already claimed. We can learn, and we can decide how to carry what we learn. Meyer nods, not in agreement with the idea of safety for safety's sake, but in acknowledgement of a principle. Power belongs to those who wield it with restraint and wisdom. She is not a risk-taker by temperament. She is a risk-taker by decision after careful evaluation. A captain who knows when courage is the responsible thing to do. The decision is made with the simplest possible act. A consent that is not loud but absolute. They will follow the map's directions, not to seize memory but to witness an event that happened long ago, to know what the planet's people thought and how they chose to live with the knowledge they built. The path to the inner chamber is not easy. It demands a careful shaping of the ship's systems, routing the field's energies through conduits that can carry the memory without boiling it away in heat. The crew works in a chorus of quiet, almost ceremonial steps. The hum of the engines muted to a calm lull, the drone's cameras blinking in a slow, purposeful rhythm, the human heart beating in the chest of each crew member with a careful and respectful tempo. When they finally reach the inner chamber, what they find is not a room, but a dimension, a quiet space where time folds upon itself, and the memory is not a single event, but a waveform that can be observed from multiple angles simultaneously. It is a place that makes philosophers of engineers, poets of physicists, and guardians of the memory of those who chose to endure in this chamber. The civilization's memory reveals its crime and its wisdom in the same breath. They faced extinction or the erasure of their own past in order to extend their survival. They chose to preserve their memory with imperfectly robust means. Knowing that future travelers might need to hear their voice, they did not rely on power or domination. They relied on memory's resilience and on the trust of travelers who would come to listen and to carry forward the story with care. In exchange for this revelation, the memory offers the crew a gift, a living algorithm, not a tool but a pedagogy, an instruction set that would enable future travelers to learn how to listen to memory and to live with it. Rather than to harvest it all or to fear it, the algorithm is not a secret to be kept, but a practice to be shared. A discipline that would let a memory teach a generation how to approach the unknown with humility and respect. Arya returns to the ship with the algorithm, not as a master or owner, but as a steward and translator. She and Meyer work together to embed the pedagogy into the Lumen's routines, teaching the crew how to approach memory as a partner rather than a quarry. They craft a small ritual, one part science, one part faith, in which new memory travels are announced with a quiet ceremony, not a blaze of headlines. They swear an oath to treat every memory with reverence, to return what is borrowed, to seek consent before touching more than a surface. The line between voyage and guardianship becomes, in time, the line between science and faith. The crew does not stop exploring. They simply learn to explore with a different intention. They still chase the universal questions. Who are we? What do we owe to the cosmos? How do we ensure that knowledge does not become a weapon? But they choose to carry a machete only for the carved paths they need to blaze themselves forward, not to cut down what others have left behind. The Icon field continues to hum, a patient, ancient being whose memory now travels with the Lumen in a more intimate, precarious, beautiful way. The ship's logbooks, once sterile toggles of timestamps and coordinates, grow pages that tell the story of a crew who learned to listen to the living past and to translate its wisdom into acts of responsibility. The memory's story becomes a living partner, a teacher no longer confined to a corner of a library, but a guide who walks in step with them through the ship's hallways and into the unknown. And yet, not every question finds a direct answer. Not every memory yields a perfect map. The universe, in its stubborn, generous way, continues to whisper, sometimes in a sigh, sometimes in a brief flash of dustlit glyphs, that there is always more to learn, always more to preserve, and always more to risk for the sake of something larger than oneself. On a night when the ship rides a gentle current of starlight, Arya, Meyer, and Jarro stand at the outer deck, looking out at the pale horizon of the Icon field. The planet, their teaching memory, glows softly in the distance. A beacon that does not burn, but invites the air, carries a clean, rain-like scent that seems to come not from any earthly storm but from the planet's own breath. As if the memory is exhaling a sigh of contentment at their decision, Arya turns to Meyer, her voice a soft, confident murmuring in the night. We did not simply collect facts. We learned to listen to a whole world's readiness to be understood by a species who chose to learn rather than to own. Meyer's face relaxes into a satisfied, quiet smile. That is the real prize of exploration, she says. Not what we found, but what we learned to become in order to find it. And in the distance, the Icon field pulses once, a long, slow heartbeat that seems to answer them in a language older than any human, and younger than all the policies and protocols of exploration that have dragged too many into the orbit of desire. It is a promise and a warning, a permission and a boundary. It tells them that there is a future in which travelers are not merely conquerors or collectors, but caretakers. It tells them that memory, like a star's light traveling across time, belongs to anyone who chooses to listen with the whole of their being. The Lumen continues on its course, now a vessel of memory and method, a ship that has become something more than the sum of its parts. Its path is no longer just a line through the dark. It is a thread weaving through the cosmos, a story that invites others to step closer, to lean in, to learn, and perhaps to remember that every voyage is also a memory we owe to the world we leave behind. And so the voyage continues, with the planet's pale light guiding them in quiet approval and the memory's gentle voice reminding them of their vow. That to listen is to become more, to know is to become responsible, and to carry memory is to carry the future in one's hands, not as a burden but as a gift. The night unfurls into a calm sea of stars. The Lumen's hull glows faintly with the soft, living harmony of a ship that has learned to breathe with the universe rather than against it. The crew rests not in sleep but in a shared rhythm of mindfulness, their bodies tired but their minds awake, their hearts steadied by the knowledge that they are now part of something larger than themselves, a living covenant with a planet and a memory that will outlast them all. The line in the console, the one that began as a crack in the system and became a doorway into a larger truth, glimmers one last time as if the memory itself were stamping a final signature on their journey. It fades into the hum of the ship's life, and the Lumen moves on, a vessel not of conquest but of kinship, carrying within its hold a memory that refuses to be forgotten and a future that insists on being reimagined with care. Continue prompt. The Lumen moves on, a vessel not of conquest but of kinship, carrying within its hold a memory that refuses to be forgotten and a future that insists on being reimagined with care. The edge of Kale's system blooms in a chorus of soft biolume. The ship's hull breathes with it, a living instrument tuning itself to a planet that has learned to forget the tenderness of contact. The crew descend into a silence that is almost holy, listening for the tremor that signals another mind asking to be understood. They find it in the archipelago, mountainless isles crowned with glass. Reefs pulsing like sleeping cities. First contact arrives as a weathered lullaby. A pattern of light and scent that travels through water and air. The Kales, scarred by centuries of drought and war, do not fear. They reach toward the lumen with a longing they scarcely know how to name. Kinship, the memory within the ship, answers with a memory of its own, a chorus of old voices that ring like bells when the dark is loud. It speaks of a time when stars and worlds spoke the same language, when care could move oceans as surely as ships. The memory reveals its origin not as a ghost story, but as a living pact, an archive of experiences laid down by a civilization that learned to protect rather than plunder. It tells of a recipe for restoring a world's breath. A rhythm of light and sea, a language of touch, a vow to share instead of own. The Kales listen, the lumen listens, and the choice crystallizes. They will release a measured portion of the memory into Kale's seas, not to erase the ship's self, but to extend its kinship into a whole world. The ritual is quiet and precise. The lumen lowers its core into a cradle of coral caldera, a living forge. The memory lifts from its cage and threads itself into the reef's columns. And the reef answers with a glow that is both older and kinder than any light known. The Kale's cities tilt toward the sea, and for the first time in generations, the reefs flicker with thought. With fear unmade and courage born anew, the ocean's pulse steadies, and with it, the people's breath in a final, unhurried moment. The lumen's identity shifts. It no longer contains a single memory, but a map of remembrance that can be read by those who listen with care. Its ships of kin become a constellation around Kale, a network of sentinels who guard the shared memory and nurture it as a living thing. The lumen, though physically diminished, becomes something larger, a beacon, a caretaker. A promise that the universe can be navigated by gentleness rather than force. The memory's light travels outward with the wind, slipping into every tide pool, every lantern city. Every child's dream. Kinship is now the engine that propels starfarers, and the lumen is the first of many such vessels to drift through the dark, leaving behind a trail of luminous, listening worlds.